You shut that? I don't want Cleo to come running in. Welcome to tonight's talk by Dr. Rob Nixon and to our year-long series, Reinventing Nature, an Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. Tonight's program will start with a short video about the humanities at URI.
We are facing problems and challenges that do not have easy, simple, finite solutions. Machines are going to be doing so much stuff for us. The only things that are going to be left are the things that only human brains can do. And those kinds of things are taught by the arts and humanities.
Studying the humanities, studying literature, drama, art, performance, what that feeds in a student is possibility.
The University of Rhode Island is a really good place to pursue one's interests in an environment of opportunities. That engagement, in some way, shape, or form, becomes in part the definition of the university experience.
Every area of the humanities trains you to investigate, explore. If you want to lead, you have to have a broad, interdisciplinary, open-minded approach to the world.
Exploration is the foundation of everything that we do. You have to be able to think beyond the circumstances you're presently in. The critical thinking, the language skills, reasoning abilities, those are the ways that you can build a bridge between what you did before and what you can do in the future.
The skills students learn in the humanities are skills that they will take into every aspect of their future life, both personal and professional.
The problems that we have facing us are complicated issues that require people who move across disciplines, think creatively, think deeply. That's something that humanities provides. You're getting that methodology and the practice that'll prepare you for your future.
Good afternoon. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities, and I'd like to welcome you to the first event in our year-long series, Re-Envisioning Nature, an Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. This year-long series of virtual and in-person events helps us to explore the ways in which the humanities can help us to interpret and engage with the pressing environmental questions of the day. This afternoon, the center is delighted to welcome Dr. Rob Nixon of Princeton University, who is speaking about slow violence and our political moment. We'll have questions and answers after the panel, so please, at any time, type your questions and comments into the chat, and be sure to like and share this talk on social media. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Eric Loomis, a historian at the URI History Department and a sought-after expert on labor and environmental history. Welcome, Dr. Loomis.
Hello, everybody. It's a real honor for me here to introduce Professor Nixon here. I have a little story to tell to begin with. In about 2011, 2012, I was in the library at URI, and I was working on a book that was about basically looking at how timber workers who were poor people, use their unions to promote their own environmental agenda over the 20th century. And I was thinking about this and working through it. And I went to the library one day, and at that time, there was a big new bookshelf that was in the middle of the first floor of the library. And there's really nothing more sort of humanities oriented than the new bookshelf, right? This place where all of this different learning comes together, and you can sit there and browse and see what people are doing, and think about things you never would have before. Sadly, the library got rid of this new bookshelf a few years ago. But the point is that I picked this new book up off the bookshelf. This pretty big book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And this is probably not a book I would have picked up otherwise. And it turned out to be by this English professor named Rob Nixon, who like totally blew my mind in ways in which we can think about the ways in which poor people engage in their own forms of environmentalism in the system of capitalism that we live with. And so ever since then, in that decade since, perhaps no book has been more influential to me than Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And so because of that, it's my very great honor to introduce Dr. Rob Nixon, who is the Thomas A. and Curie C. Barron Family Professor in Humanities and the Environment at Princeton University, where he is in both the English Department and Environmental Studies. He's also written several other books, London Calling, V.S. Naipaul, Post-Colonial Mandarin, Homelands, Harlem and Hollywood, South African Culture and the World Beyond, and Dreambirds, The Natural History of a Fantasy. He's published basically everywhere on top of this, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Guardian, the Nation. We could go on and on and on, and he's got a whole biography, but no one's here to listen to me. I want to, again, introduce Dr. Rob Nixon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you for those kind words. And thank you, Eve, for making this possible. And thank you, Leah, for all the support that you've given us. So I just wanted to share these slides with you. So what I thought I would do was to revisit the ideas in Slow Violence, but with a twist, with two different shifts. That book was really very much around the witnessing undertaken by kind of writer activists. And I wanted in the talk today to focus on visual artists, because as I lay out in the book, there's a particular quandary that we face in dealing with slow violence. In other words, with violence that is not spectacular or instantaneous, but unfolds over years or decades or millennia. So there's an imaginative challenge at the heart of slow violence. And I'm very interested in the creative ways in which visual artists have responded to that. So the second thing I wanted to do a little differently from in the book was I wanted to bring it up to date by focusing on a number of issues that are very germane to our time. Political issues, particularly climate breakdown, COVID, the movement for Black lives, and the Anthropocene. So I thought I'd start with this image by Isaac Cordell, and it's an image of the climate summit and this idea of a homogeneous group with their backs turned against the world as the waters incrementally rise up to their necks. And so it's I think speaks very much to this question of slow violence and the incremental nature of slow violence, and also the power of prevarication when we cannot sufficiently imagine ourselves into the urgency around us. So let me just, for those who aren't familiar with the idea, let me root slow violence in a couple of images. First, a quote: "Every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be inhabitable." So we're very accustomed to encountering this kind of thinking in our current moment with a focus on climate change. What's interesting is that this statement was made in 1961 by President Kennedy, and he was referring not to climate breakdown, but to the nuclear threat. Now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the nuclear threat has accrued greater attention once more. But overall, the threat that is most discussed in the 21st century, as opposed to the late 20th century, is climate change. So the thing about the nuclear threat is that obviously with nuclear fallout, you have a kind of slow violence, an embedding of that threat in the landscape, but you also have a very, very powerful cinematic image. of the mushroom cloud. And we think of, say, when in advance of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Condoleezza Rice said, we don't want the smoking gun to become the mushroom cloud. And most people could envisage what that would look like. Okay. If we compare that to something like glaciers melting, it's much harder to find a cinematic image that concentrates that threat in that almost psychedelic way that that we have with the mushroom cloud. And yet, if we just take the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas, something like 40% of the world's population depend on the stability of that glacial melt, on the holding action of the glaciers and the sort of staggered release of those waters. So livelihoods, millions upon millions of lives are at stake if those glaciers are destabilized. But it's a real struggle to come up with an image that doesn't suffer from some kind of drama deficit, a lack of dramatic urgency. So I want to ground this in two other images by my colleague Anne McClintock, and this is from the Deep Horizon oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico in, I think, 2010. And 11 people were killed in the explosion. But then we had COVID, we had Corexit that was sprayed over the water. So we had this sort of coagulant that is banned in Europe, but was widely sprayed in the Gulf. And it glommed onto the oil and was suspended just below the surface. And so that orangey pink in the upper left corner is an example of the slow violence of after the spectacular explosion, you have the permeation of a threat into the ecosystem, impacting human and non-human health. We feel we have to use depleted uranium. It's radioactive. I wish it wasn't, but I can't change the laws of physics. The issue is once you've had a hit, once you're involved in the catastrophic failure of the tank, did the crew survive long enough to really care whether it was tungsten or depleted uranium that hit them? Anyone who does survive should count themselves damn lucky. I'm sure every soldier would thank God that he lived 40 years to contract lymphoma. So this was in response to a debate about the ethics of using depleted uranium, which has a chemical and a chemical threat, poses a chemical threat. And what this colonel is pointing to in a kind of very direct way is that given the choice between an immediate death or a deferred death in the case of lymphoma, every soldier would take the deferred death. Okay, but that clearly raises the question of what are the ethics of allowing the products that cause those deferred deaths to permeate the environment. This is one other example. During the rainy season, thousands of tons of topsoil are eroded from Kenya's countryside by rivers and washed into the ocean and lakes. Additionally, soil is lost through wind erosion in areas where the land is devoid of vegetative cover. Losing topsoil should be considered analogous to losing territory to an invading enemy. And indeed, if any country were so threatened, it would mobilize all available resources, including a heavily armed military, to protect the priceless land. Unfortunately, the loss of soil through these elements has yet to be perceived with such urgency. So this is a statement by the 2005 Nobel Peace Prize winner, Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who spearheaded a tree planting movement that eventually planted 100 million trees, mainly by rural women. But what she's making a very good point here, that something like deforestation, which has a real impact on aridity, on the availability of water and food, and on childhood malnutrition, can have a real impact on a community's longevity, their life expectancy. But it's hard to see that, even if an equivalent number of people were slowly having their lives foreshortened, it would be hard to see that as equivalent to a military invasion. And it's hard to recognize that something like deforestation can catalyze deaths over the long haul. So I said I was going to talk primarily about images, and this is one, I think, a very powerful image that's an allusion to perhaps one of the most famous war photographs of all time by Eddie Adams of a South Vietnamese general summarily executing a Viet Cong prisoner. And this was a very powerful image during the anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States. And the logo at the back is the BP logo. And so what he's trying to do is the artist is taking an everyday item, the pump at the gas pump, and turning it into a gun, and so creating a compressed version of the threat of slow violence, the threat of CO2 in the atmosphere, and its link to our consumption of these fuels. And this was in response, in part, to what the images I showed you earlier of the Gulf oil spill that was resulted from BP's neglect. So when we come to an issue like fracking, this again is an amorphous threat. It's very poorly regulated. You have methane entering the atmosphere, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And we have the toxins, the fracking fluids, entering the aquifer in the water table and causing untold and largely unregulated harms. So when the filmmaker Josh Fox decided to make a film on fracking, he needed a concentrated image, an image that conveyed urgency. And the image that he chose was of people across the country taking a cigarette lighter to the faucet, to the tap, and lighting it. And instead of water coming out, gases come out that catch fire. Okay. And so this image recurs as a motif across the film, and it's almost the dominant visual impression that we come away with. So he would go to Wyoming, Pennsylvania, Alaska, Texas, and just get regular people to do this with their taps and show the immense problem of the slow violence that is entering the fundamental life systems that people depend on. So one of the most talked about paradigms at the moment is the Anthropocene, and the idea being that as humans, collectively, we have tilted the Earth into a whole new era. So the relatively stable environment of the Holocene, under which human civilizations arose, has been destabilized. And the cumulative effect of human actions has been to change the biology, chemistry, and geology of Earth to a greater extent than any other living form has done since the cyanobacteria 2.5 billion years ago oxygenated the Earth. Okay, so there's a powerful series of sculptures by Jason de Queiroz Taylor, and these are undersea sculptures that he erected off the coast of Mexico primarily. And so this is an image of the automobile age, the age of high carbon consumption. And the figure is an ambiguous one. We're not sure if that figure is sleeping, if there's been a collision of sorts. But there's the car and the figure are antiquated. They're relics, in a sense, at the bottom of an ocean left over from the carbon-intensive age that we live in now. And I think there's an allusion here in his work to Pompeii. In the case of Pompeii and also in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, part of the power of what remained was of people being caught in everyday postures, sort of frozen in time. And so in those cases, like here in Pompeii, there was an instantaneous freezing of a calamity when the volcano erupted. But in the case of something like the attritional damage caused by the slow violence of greenhouse gases, it's incremental. And so I think one of the things that Jason de Taylor is trying to do is to condense long time periods into a single memorable retrospective image of our current age. And this is a particularly fascinating image, I think, because you have these two figures on the surface, these scuba divers that seem to belong almost to another realm. They're almost angelic figures with the surface light behind them, transcendental figures. And the distance between them and the figure on the car is not just a physical distance, but it's also a temporal distance. It's a retrospective look at our age. They're looking at it as kind of future observers of our current era. And to me, this image is reminiscent of one of Walter Benjamin's theses in the philosophy of history, where he talks about the angel of history as being blown back into the future, and as its wings spread, it looks back on the ruins of progress. And to me, this is a similar kind of effect of these people looking back on the ruins of a bygone age. This is another attempt by artists to condense slow violence into a single memorable image. So before the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, the then president of the Maldives island staged in video and image a theater of his island's inundation, their disappearance. So like many islands, particularly in the Pacific, the Maldives is just a few feet above sea level. In this case, I think the highest point in the Maldives is 7 feet above sea level. And so incrementally with rising oceans, the Maldivians are facing an existential threat. And so what he's offering here is a imaginary cabinet meeting in the year 2050, when the islands have disappeared and the people of the Maldives are living kind of below the surface of the water. And so this is his actual cabinet. They're signing a commitment to being carbon neutral by 2050. But it's even with the Gothic hair and so forth, there's an attempt to, by an obscure, small, relatively powerless nation, to draw international attention to the plight of low-lying islands faced with the slow violence of rising waters. So one of the most powerful and resonant movements in the last few years has been the movement for Black Lives. And I'm very interested in the symbolic repertoire of that movement and how it has kind of caught fire internationally, and really had a powerful imaginative impact on the way people perceive environmental justice. That's an image from Beijing, where one of the many cities that has had very chronic pollution problems. And Chinese artists have very much been at the fore of trying to represent the crisis of breathing. And this is all taking place before the movement for Black Lives. But this marriage ceremony, theatrical marriage ceremony in Beijing, was focusing on the way in which even the simple joys of life, the ceremonial joys of life, are compromised by the slow violence of polluted air. This again is from the same series of images. Again, this is pre-COVID. I mean, it looks almost like a COVID image. This is long pre-COVID. And the student activists here were doing a couple of things. I think with the X on the mouth, you have the sense both of the difficulty of breathing, of struggling through the mask and the plastic to get breath. And also the mouth is the source of speech. So the X over the mouth is about censorship and being silenced. So with the movement for Black Lives, we had the use of masks both as a surface for protest slogans, a place for artists in various ways to display their sentiment and their images even. The mask is also obviously about safety and breathing and trying to keep toxins out. The mask can also, under some circumstances, be used to disguise identity. And so all of these elements are present in masking, and as in part a response to both the immediate brutality of police violence and the incremental brutality of the structural violence that has produced or created sacrifice zones where disproportionately people of color and poorer people reside. So that's Eric Garner. As you know, his final words, 11 times he said, "I can't breathe," and that became a slogan for the movement. So as Julie Zay and Elizabeth Dillon have pointed out in an important article, one of the things about the murder of Eric Garner was that he suffered from asthma, and that asthma itself was a result of residing in a poor community in Staten Island, which was by far the most polluted of the New York boroughs. And so there was a structural racism that had created a disability in him. And then that disability was then compounded, made him vulnerable to the immediate brutality of the police chokehold. So we breathe something like 22,000 times a day. It's an unconscious, mostly involuntary act, but it's the most urgent of our needs as a life form, even more urgent than food or water, shelter. And so it's not surprising that metaphors of breathing suffuse our language. If you talk about somebody walking into the room and sucking all the oxygen out the room, we're talking about people saying, I need more breathing room, okay? And I think part of the power, the international power of the slogan, I can't breathe or we can't breathe, has a lot to do with the fact that it's very physical. Most people have experienced a breathing crisis of one kind or another, not necessarily through a chokehold or tear gas or that, but even through drowning or choking on food. So we know the physiological panic that overtakes the body when we can't breathe. But there is also a social idea, metaphorically, of freedom as breathing room, as breathing free. And so this is in the wake of the movement for Black Lives. This was a response, an editing of Emma Lazarus's poem inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. So we also have examples of slow resistance, okay? And there is a way, I think, in which the movement for Black Lives has allowed people to think together questions of immediate brutality and there's questions of the slow, compromising of Black lives and lives of people of color through things like the military-industrial complex, creation of sacrifice zones, what's so-called fence line communities, like in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and the ways in which redlining and all of the prison industrial complex, all of these impact the well-being and the life expectancy of many people of color and poorer communities. And so I think that it's a powerful movement, particularly the way the artists have taken up these issues. It's a powerful movement for thinking together instantaneous violence, a normal understanding of violence, and the longue durée of slow violence. And I mentioned that these images have, and the slogan has circulated very powerfully around the world. I've seen sort of street artists and produce murals about I can't breathe or we can't breathe in Jakarta, Cairo, Lagos, Rio de Janeiro, and in this case, Cape Town. So this is a very interesting image because the street artists put it up on a wall, and it's a very particular wall in that when tourists, Cape Town is a tourist hub, and when tourists arrive at the airport and travel to the scenic center of the city, they pass by various shanty towns. And these walls were put up because the shanty towns were deemed unsightly and also to prevent people from crossing the highway. But there's a layered meaning to the slogan in this context, because on the one hand, you have the toxins from the highway traffic, like you have in, say, the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York, where we know that particularly Latino communities in the Bronx suffer very heavily from asthma. So you have the asthmatic fallout of the highway traffic. There's also a huge coal-fired plant located near this sacrifice zone, informal settlement that's a sacrifice zone. But like many poor communities around the world, they also suffer from unanswerable policing and brutal policing. So both literally and metaphorically, I think this artist was taking up the slogan and saying, there are all these ways in which it's very hard for us to find breathing room. I showed earlier the image of the hangman's noose by the Nigerian street artist with Ken Saro-Wiwa being hanged for his activism, environmental activism. And this is a sort of the positive side of the way that these echoes reverberate around the world. This is an image of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the so-called Ogoni 8, who were executed by the Nigerian regime in 1995 with him. And it's a poem of his translated from Ogoni, his native language, into English, and then from there into Gaelic. And this mural I encountered on the west coast of Ireland, where environmental activists were struggling with a gas line that was being built from the shore through a fishing community, an estuary, and impacting the livelihoods of the fishing community and greatly increasing the risks to the area. And so one of the things they did in this town was they renamed their street after the Ogoni activists who'd been murdered by the state for their activism, and created a kind of a corridor of connection that was both activist and also represented in the imagery, the kind of what the anthropologist Anna Tsing calls traveling allegories, moving between one affected fishing community in Nigeria and another one in Ireland. This is a protest by indigenous people in Bolivia, and their historic territory was being was at risk of being turned over to mining. Some minerals were discovered there. And so what they decided to do was to stage a march from their low-lying community all the way to the capital, to La Paz, in Bolivia, the highlands. So it took them literally 3 months to walk. And they gathered people in the protest along the way. But what it did was it created a kind of a staggered story, an ongoing story of protest, whereby they were using time, in a sense, as an asset to build awareness, to build the movement. So rather than having like a one-day protest, they had this march that people could join in, and ultimately they were successful in turning back the mine. So there's a lot of talk about climate change as slow violence, and the way in which we need the humanities to think beyond our rather limited ideas of violence. And if we go all the way back to Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring, in 1962, there she talks about death by indirection, the fact that after World War II, we had all of these plastics and chemical compounds that were released in unprecedented numbers into the environment and causing harms, but there was no research to even know what harms they were causing individually, let alone in combination. So I was very struck by this image and this quote: "We're all in the same storm, we are not in the same boat." So you have the huge cruise ship in the background, and you have an individual rower trying to make progress, abandoned in their own vessel, if you like. And at first I thought this had to be an image about climate change, about the people who are protected from it and the people who are abandoned to the fallout of climate change. But actually it was from the UK Mental Health Society, and it was referring to COVID, how COVID arrives in the world, and it's a global phenomenon, but it doesn't impact all communities equally. In other words, some communities, largely because of the structural unraveling of safety nets under neoliberalism, because of that, some communities are more abandoned and less prepared to face something like a pandemic than others. And so I think it works both as an image of COVID and as an image of climate. And so I wanted to close with this image, which I think is a very powerful one, by the artist, Spanish muralist Sam 3, and it's called Deep Rooted. And what you have is a surface act of deforestation, going back to the Wangari Maathai quote I started out with, where you have a simple act of felling a tree. But as she explains, that act has reverberations. It can compound aridity. It can compound the blowing away of unanchored topsoil, and therefore has long-term effects, including malnutrition and the difficulty of finding water and firewood. But what I find quite powerful about this image is that you have the surface act, and then the trickle-down effect through the veins and the aorta of the body. And so it's an image about the long-term consequences of that surface act for the human body, for the body politic, and for the living body of the land itself. And I think the way that in a sense, this is depicted as a brainless act. The head is being severed from the invisible body, but those repercussions are felt in any event. Okay, so I'll be very happy to answer any questions you have, and I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Nixon. And I want to remind all of our viewers and listeners that you can type questions into the chat box. They will come to me, and then I will read them out. We have a couple already, but I want to start with a question, actually, which is that, the power historically, the power of images in influencing the environmental movement, let's just say within the United States, has been very important. Thinking here about the image of the Cuyahoga River burning in 1969, although that image was actually from an earlier fire, or thinking about the image of the Earth as this isolated, this isolated planet within the blackness of space that came out of the Apollo missions. And and I was thinking about that when you were talking about this, because those images did so much to promote a positive environmental change in the 1960s and 70s. Today, I feel that so many people, especially younger people, are a bit pessimistic, hopeless, depressed by the state of the environment. And I don't blame them for that. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the images that you are examining and analyzing, how can we use these images to both take seriously the very, incredible problems that we face, but also to inspire change and hope and a fight in the face of a capitalist system that continues to, spew out emissions in an incredibly environmentally unequal nation and world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric, and I think you're absolutely right that if we go back to the 60s, you have a convergence of the power of a book like Silent Spring, particularly if we think of it as it was turned into a documentary that I think was watched by 1/10 of all American households simultaneously. This was a time when there was obviously no internet and there were only 3 TV channels. So very concentrated, instantaneous impact of that book, followed in the years thereafter by the Cuyahoga spontaneous combustion of the river, the Santa Barbara oil spills, where you had images of these distraught cormorants and otters and various creatures that were coated in oil. So those images were very, very powerful. And then, as you say, in a positive light, the Apollo 8 images of the blue planet, this very small-looking precious blue marble against the backdrop of a black universe, and a context where that year had been a particularly explosive year with the assassination of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the explosive scenes at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and so forth. So there was an image that around of unity, fragility, the need to come together. Okay, and I think for me, one of the most positive things that has been happening in the last 5 to 10 years, and it speaks to many of the social movements that I'm referring to here, has been the movement to the surface, the foregrounding of environmental justice. Even 5 or 10 years ago, if I said to somebody I was an environmental justice scholar, they would say, what is that? What does that mean? But I think particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, there has been a sense in which the old idea that was quite prevalent, at least in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, that environmentalism was about where people weren't, in other words, wilderness spaces. And now environmentalism is about where people are. And there is, I think, a very, very powerful connection between public health and environmental health that is almost unbreakable now in terms of what it means to be an environmentalist. So if you think of AOC and the Green New Deal and so forth, all these questions about housing and redlining that are integrated into the discourse of the environment in ways that they weren't previously. So that's an encouraging thing. And I also do take heart from the artist activists, including visual artists, who are trying to find ways to use images to create alliances around the world. And these what the anthropologist Hannah Tsing calls traveling allegories, little memes or little images that are recognized, create these moments of recognition at both exposing injustice and then also trying to articulate visually forms of hope and forms of togetherness. But just as you have slow violence, there's also slow activism. And it's just, I remember showing a film exposing climate change. And somebody said, well, that film came out in 2012 and things haven't changed. The film didn't work. And it's much more complicated than that, as we know. But there are these tipping points, and I've lived through so many revolutions where the status quo seemed set in stone, whether it was apartheid in South Africa or the AIDS crisis in the late 80s and 90s, where you had, images like silence equals death had a huge amount of power. And it seemed like, or even marriage equality, they seemed improbable. But you do get these tipping points. And in that regard, given the power of the environmental justice movements, I do find signs of encouragement that generationally, at least, there is a shift in connecting public health with environmental health and speaking back and creating back against the unjust inequalities, including intergenerational equalities, that neoliberalism has sort of institutionalized.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's such a critical point that, we feel like nothing can change, but things in fact can change very, very quickly.
Right.
If you've done the prep work and the organizing to make that happen. And I think you are, as I agree with you, are seeing that in many different ways right now. So the next question I'll bring you is from, you can see it right there, from Katie Mack, who is actually Kathleen McIntyre in Gender and Women's Studies. And she asked, I was really struck by the sculptures building on historic natural disasters / images of violence, such as the Pompeii and Vietnam War references. Just curious if you know of any climate change artists who have been criticized for building on past images or past or current political movements, or is the reception overwhelmingly positive to make these connections between time periods and movements?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and perhaps one that's particularly resonant for historians. I'm not a historian, so I should be disqualified from any expertise here, but I think for anybody who's been involved in a social movement, we face dilemmas of what Gayatri Spivak calls strategic essentialism. To come up with a slogan, to come up with a forceful image, you have to simplify and compress things. And so I think I don't know of criticism that these artists have faced. There are always risks of appropriation, and those are issues that we need to be alive to. But at the same time, we need strategically, we need certain forms of simplicity to rally around, and then you can radiate out and create the complexity. But you can't sort of mobilize people around a tome, or around very elaborate histories of a particular struggle. So I'm always interested in the costs and benefits of strategic essentialism, of concentrating in an image or a phrase like "We Can't Breathe" or "Black Lives Matter" or "Silence Equals Death," concentrating very complicated issues in an image that reaches people emotionally. In the little video about the humanities that we saw at the beginning of this talk, one of the speakers mentioned the importance of thinking beyond your immediate circumstances. And so I think one of the things that the humanities does really well and is absolutely vital is moving us into different time frames, different periods, and different geographical circumstances, and sometimes seeing forms of with a kind of half recognition, versions of our own experience that are different in some ways, but also bind us to those people and places with potential for empathy, compassion, alliance building, and the coming together of transformative energies.
Thank you so much. We should have another question coming up here. I can read it. From my colleague, the environmental historian Jimenez Sevilla. To what extent can scholars learn from the power of visual representations to make research more available regarding the effects of climate change in general?
Yeah, I think this is tremendously important. And many of the scientists that I work with and talk to at Princeton and elsewhere are very alive to the limitations of data per se. The data is absolutely essential, but scientists are not, or many scientists, I should say, are not sort of trained in representational strategies in public delivery. And part of what's at the heart of the humanities is non-data driven knowledge. How do we know that Rachel Carson's book was influential? We don't. We know that it was read by millions of people. It was the movie was seen, the documentary by millions of people. We know that Kennedy held the book up and spoke of its importance. But we can't quantify the way it changed American society. And so we're at an angle to the data people. And I do think that there are complementary skills that can be brought together to make essential climate data, for instance, more transmissible. We see a lot of before and after photographs. As I mentioned, my colleague Anne McClintock has been doing that with glacial melting, and as well as working in the Gulf with the Gulf spill. So I do think there's a lot of room both for artists and humanists to work with scientists. And as one example of that, Jim Hansen, probably the most famous climate scientist in the world, who was warning of the threat of climate change in the US Senate back in 1988. Initially, when Al Gore wanted to make his film about climate change, Jim Hansen said, no, it's much too complicated. You can't simplify it like that. And then when he saw the wild anti-science polemics coming from the other side, he said, go ahead, simplify it. Just use it. It's the other side is so extremely anti-science and so crazy in a sense that as a scientist, I must accept that all the complexities that I have researched are not transmissible to a general audience, but you can transmit the bare bones, and it's urgent that you do so.
Yeah, and I think I want to thank you on this. I think that for a lot of us who are in the environmental humanities, we often want to provide a little bit more, our skills in dealing with these broader environmental issues that very often, because of the way that higher education operates, scientists get more priority, more say, more media than a lot of people in the humanities. But but at the same time, I think that for many of us, we believe very strongly in the in the need to communicate and our ability to provide that level of communication, as you've shown in your own talk today.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have another question coming up here. This is from, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Laxman Srinivasan. Forgive me if I did not say that correctly, but some resistance to environmental conservation among third world countries is because the richer nations become wealthy by ruining the environment, but the others are now being forced to take a slower path to development. Why isn't economic compensation linked to environmental goals economic justice to go with environmental justice? And I think that's a great question.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's a very, very live debate. I showed that image of Mohammed Nasheed, the former president of the Maldives Islands, and there's a very powerful film about him, documentary called The Island Presidents, where he gets into a debate with the Prime Minister of India. And it's quite a heated debate, and they're both from the global south. They have both countries have suffered from imperialism and resource extraction. But the president of the Maldives says, well, it's not just a rich-poor divide. There are some countries that are topographically more vulnerable and are going to go under or face an existential crisis if countries, so-called developing countries in the global south, like India, pursue unchecked the same path of industrialization or an analogous path of industrialization to the richer nations. So that's where there's a whole debate around belatedness. You had your turn, now it's our turn. Now, clearly, that's a way of fast-tracking social and environmental ruin, and that's why these questions of reparations and what are the different responsibilities of the dominant emitter nations, historically and in the present, in relation to countries like, say, Nigeria, where the average Nigerian emissions is equal to one non-return flight from New York to LA. Okay, so these inequities, historically and in the present, are very much part of the issue that you raise in the question of how do we balance economic justice with planetary survival, basically.
Yeah. All right, thank you for that. I know we have at least one more question. Yes, from Billy Bowden. As a PhD candidate in English, I have a bias toward print media, but I would like to ask whether you think specific mediums are more effective than others in conveying the urgency of slow violence.
I think it's a good question, and we live in such a complex media environment now. I'm both an immigrant and a non-native digital person. I'm not a digital native, so I remember a simpler environment. I think now the fact is we have a plethora of platforms, and the thing is to experiment with those platforms. So there are things that maybe narrative and words can do, and there are things that images can do, and there are things that the two can do together in complementary ways. And so, when people are writing about issues that they feel passionately about, what I encourage them to do is to experiment with different platforms and find where they get the most traction, and also in your own work to look at what affects you. What made a difference to you? What pulled you up short and made you rethink something you thought either you didn't care about or you thought you knew. And so I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. And I do believe there is a powerful role both for the written word and the image. And I do believe that there's a role for narrative complexity and iconic concentration.
Hey, thank you. Next question is from our colleague Karen Markin, who asks, our grassroots efforts our best hope for change? Our short election cycles don't reward addressing long-term issues, even if politicians acknowledge environmental problems.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a really important question. And so, I think a lot of us feel kind of stretched. On the one hand, we're encouraged to think about the Anthropocene, these vast tracts of geological time. On the other hand, our brains, neurologically, we're being reorganized by the digital culture we live in. And so I can, even recall a different way of reading before digital options were available, where I was much more likely to pick up a book, sit with the book until I'd finished it. Now, if it's the right book, I will get into it, but the number of distractions that can pull me away from that are far more they're far more numerous and far more complex. So I think that the short election cycle clearly is a problem, particularly when we're dealing with a chemically complex world, much more complex than, say, in pre-World War II time, or let alone the 19th century. So that a politician can sort of green light, say, a plastics factory and claim that lots of jobs being created, and they know that the fallout from that plastic factory will be downstream, will occur downstream in time, and they probably won't even be in office when the worst of those impacts occur. So in that sense, I think that the pressure from the grassroots is immensely, immensely important. And one of the things that environmental justice movement has done quite successfully, and in this I think it's been helped by the rise of the digital realm, is diversify the voices who are speaking for the environment and increasing the chances or the opportunities for people to spread and bear witness to the locations they're actually living in and connect up with other people. So one of the things I've been working on quite a bit is deforestation in the Amazon. And there, one of the things that's been very successful is equipping indigenous people with technologies, surveillance technologies, drones, night cameras, and so forth, that allow them to document illegal logging and to produce visual data that can be used in prosecuting people who are encroaching on indigenous lands and so forth.
All right, thank you again. And the next question is another question from Luxman, who asks if there's been any resistance to using the phrase "I can't breathe" in the environmental context because it may dilute the message about police violence.
There may be. I haven't encountered it. I don't see I think for most people, those are not in tension, but they reinforce each other. And what has been quite striking about I Can't Breathe is that it is a phrase that is taken off even in societies where you don't have many black people. You have, other groups or ethnicities or castes or whatever who feel that speaks to their physiological and political oppression. So I haven't seen any pushback, and I do think that for most people, there's a recognition that something like police brutality, while it's immediate and spectacularly violent and very traumatizing, is not an isolated phenomenon, but literally bleeds into these other structural inequities and the other forms of slow violence that have produced communities that are perceived by the powers that be as disposable or less, in some sense, are living less valuable lives. And so that's where I think that the vocalization of I Can't Breathe or We Can't Breathe from below has really it's spread like wildfire around the planet, and people are saying yes, we are being oppressed as poor people typically are from Rio to Nairobi, because they don't have powerful defenders in the courts or in parliament or wherever, and they're able to say yes. There are long-term histories, colonial histories, histories of enslavement that are actually relevant to the way that black or minority bodies are being beaten up today or threatened today.
Thank you again, and I'm going to close us out here with a last question. In I've been teaching a course this semester called Global Environmental History. And in kind of preparing this week for your talk and going into last week, we're talking about concepts of ecological imperialism and kind of following some of this through time. And, today, because I sort of study the intersection of the labor and environmental movements, we were talking about the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh in 2013 and the ways in which, workers who are being oppressed on the job are also being oppressed ecologically. They're talking about the pollution in which they face and the poisons and the learning issues that come out of this, et cetera. And one of a question from a very good student is one that I think we frequently get, which is which was along the lines of, I'm an individual. We live in an era of fast fashion. What can I do to change this system when my personal actions probably are not going to make a big difference? And so I guess what I want, and I had answers to this, but I kind of want to ask you the same question. What are acts that we as developed world, global north people can take that are, either are going to make a difference or are solidarity acts with those who are, who are engaging in resistance to this ecological imperialism? How do we step into a political arena, whether it's through direct action, through using images in different ways, or the other many forms of environmental activism that you've been involved with over the years?
Yeah, so no, I think this is a very profound and urgent question. So I think that there was a time when people were urging individual actions, and so change the light bulb and so forth, which are have merit in their own right. And even the oil companies like BP and Exxon that would say, I forget which particular oil company it was, put out a question: what are you doing for the environment today? And so individualizing the process, taking it away from structural inequalities. And there was a huge pushback from people who said, you're pulling a fast one on us. You're gaslighting us. What are you as a corporation doing for the environment? And you're trying to put it back on the consumer. Okay, so individual consumer acts need to be, or consumer choices need to be melded with social transformation, structural transformations that we as individuals are not empowered on our own to effect. That said, there is so much more work being done now on corporate answerability and corporations being called to task for their environmental practices. And there, corporations are more and more anxious, I would say, about being stigmatized, being seen as whether it's a relationship to questions of abortion, questions of the environment. There are certain push button issues that corporations know they need to avoid alienating people on. And so it's a complex business because of the elaborate serpentine global supply chain. But there are more and more energies, I think, coming from the grassroots and then in many instances supported by international NGOs that are trying to force corporations to be more transparent about their labor practices and about the environmental fallout of those labor practices.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to thank you so much, Professor Nixon. This has been absolutely amazing and incredibly valuable for the community here at URI. Before we let everybody go, I did want to announce the second speaker in this amazing series. We'll have 7 speakers over the year. And the second talk is on Thursday, October 13th at 4 p.m., where Jeffrey Bolster of the University of New Hampshire will be giving a talk on the mortal sea, fishing the Atlantic in the age of sail. And that'll be at the Hope Room in the Higgins Welcome Center, and will also be live streamed for those of you who cannot make it. And I want to thank as well my colleague Eve Stern, the head of the Center for Humanities, for all the work she's done in putting this together. So in conclusion, Professor Nixon, thank you again, and good afternoon, everybody.